Good evening and welcome to the National Landlord Association and Urban.co.uk webinar on the ultimate checklist. So we're going to provide you with the ultimate landlord checklist, everything you should be doing, everything you need to know at the start of a residential tenancy. If you follow the points that we are going to give you tonight, you should be well on your way to a pain-free and compliant tenancy. So we're going to take you from the point at which you find a tenant all the way through to checking them in. So we're going to take you through referencing, right to rent, deposits, some pointers on the contract, inventory, and then a safety checklist. And as I said, if you cover off all the points we say, in most cases you're going to have a compliant tenancy and you're going to be really well set up for a good and hopefully hassle-free tenancy. So we've got Polly Rivers today with us, and she heads up the Landlord University, so she's a fountain of knowledge on all his lettings and landlord legislation. Polly, please introduce yourself.
Hello everyone, good evening. It's lovely to be this side of the microphone. As Adam mentioned, I head up the Landlord University. I work very closely with the NLA and sort of monitor all the legislation that's going on and try to keep you guys all nicely informed on the changes in the letting world. So thanks for having me, and it's lovely to be here this evening.
Okay, great. So we're going to start with the start of the process once you've found a tenant, or what should be the start, which is referencing. You've got two options. You can either reference a tenant yourself, and a lot of landlords do this, or you can use a professional referencing agency. Now, a professional referencing agency will be used to all the sort of excuses and all the things that some tenants might do to get round referencing, such as getting their mates to pose as a landlord or an employer. So they will be good at doing this and recognising this and have procedures in place to avoid that. So it is worth thinking about using a professional referencing agency. If you do, you should also use one that is on the board of insurers. So that means that if they pass a reference, then generally insurance companies will underwrite that tenant for rent guarantee insurance. If they are not on the board of insurance, then you have to question if their referencing process is rigorous enough for you. So use a reputable and good referencing company to reference your tenants. So generally it's going to be three different areas: your employment check, your landlord check, and then your finance and credit check that you'll be looking for when you're referencing a tenant. The first one, employment check. The tenant will be giving you details of where they are employed and who you need to contact to verify their income and that they have been employed. You'll be looking for how long they've been employed, if they're on a permanent contract or a temporary contract, when they started the employment, are they still in a probationary period, how much they're earning and what their hours are. When you're given the details of the employer, you need to ensure that it isn't a friend of theirs that's posing as their employer. So get the details, get the name of the company, and then verify through a third party, and these days it's very easy with the internet, and try and contact that person through another means other than the means that the tenant has given you. And what I mean by that is by perhaps Googling the company and phoning the switchboard and asking for that person, rather than using a mobile phone number or a direct dial. And that means that you're verifying that person actually works at that company through your own means, rather than relying on the tenant. Very often a tenant will be self-employed, so you then need to verify that they have enough income. So you can ask for tax returns, or you can ask for accountant's details and then verify it through the accountant. It generally takes a bit longer, but it is still worth doing, and it's always worth asking plenty of questions and verifying that you're happy with the information you're getting is correct.
It can feel a bit awkward sometimes asking so many questions about something so personal, but you are, after all, potentially handing over the keys to your biggest asset. So it's not too. You've got to be aware that that's a fairly valid questions to ask. I think it's not.
And what we find, and we do lots and lots, thousands of these every month, and what we find is that the tenants that start getting aggressive, perhaps when further questions are asked, are usually the tenants that have something to hide. So don't be afraid to ask a question. You're handing over the keys to a very, very expensive asset into the custodian of this tenant. So you're within your rights to ask plenty of questions. A lot of most professional referencing companies will not ask for bank statements, but that doesn't mean the landlord can't ask. And it's a tool which you can use to verify income. So once you've verified employment and you've verified their wage, you want to see that that wage is being paid into the account. So it's another fail-safe really, to ensure that the employer is the real employer. So you'll see the money coming in, and also no matter how many credit checks and landlord checks, employment checks you do, you can't assess how well that tenant manages their money. Just before the tenancy starts, they may have taken on a personal loan or a finance on a car, which renders them unable to afford the rent. And you'll be able to see that through their bank statements and see how well they run their lives through their bank statements. And it's a really good tool to get a bit more information about if that tenant is financially going to be a good tenant and very worthwhile.
And don't forget, not everything's always black and white. I mean, you might have a tenant approach you who might be retired on a fairly small pension, but they might, so from a financial basis, they might not actually meet the rental criteria. However, they may just have sold a family home and have the balance sat in their bank account, and they might be looking for the perfect property to buy, but they've just not found it yet, and they're looking to rent in the meantime. So they would have more than enough in their account to pay the rent, but from a referencing point of view, they might not pass it on the income stream. So don't assume until you've covered the avenues off.
Okay, so moving on to the previous landlord check, another very important one. Another one which a lot of landlords worry for two reasons. One, that again, it might not genuinely be that landlord, it might be a friend that's posing as the landlord. And the second one that we hear that a lot of landlords worry about is that the landlord they're such a bad tenant that the landlord wants them out, and they can only get out when they found another property. So the landlord is going to give them a glowing reference just to get rid of them. So it's worth, again, the bank statements. You can check that the rent's been paid on time. So if the landlord is saying something that isn't true with regards to rent being paid, you'll be able to see on their bank statements that money going out. So that's another good reason why you get bank statements, to verify that when you ask the landlord, was the rent paid on time, that it actually was. You can check that landlord owns the property. So it's very easy to go to Land Reg and do a quick Land Reg check on their previous property to make sure that landlord is who he says he is. When you get the reference, if you're on the phone, ask the landlord a few basic questions. What's the postcode of the property? If it's someone posing as the landlord, they're probably not going to be that well briefed. They're probably not going to answer that question very quickly. So a few basic questions that you'll expect to hear quick answers to will maybe enable you to raise some red flags if they don't know the answers to them quickly. Ask why the tenant is moving out. Again, it should be an easy answer to the question. Ask them if the tenancy was handled in a satisfactory manner. Ask them the condition the property was left in, and as I said, ask them if rent was always paid on time and if they would recommend them as a tenant. So just that small list of questions. It should be a 10-15 minute conversation. You should get a good idea, or a small list of questions over email. You should get a really good idea as to whether they're genuine and whether that reference is a good reference or not. Moving on to the credit check. So credit check is very important. It's not a complete picture. A lot of landlords rely solely on the credit check. It's important to do it, but it's also important that it's not a complete picture of the tenant. It will give you an overall score of their credit history, and it will also flag any unresolved county court judgments that may be against them. So this is when someone has taken, a company or maybe a previous landlord has taken the tenant to court. It's been found that they do owe the person or the company money and they haven't yet paid it, and that will show up on a credit check. It's a good idea that if you have a tenant with a county court judgment against them, that you dig deeper and you find out exactly what that's about and why it's not satisfied. Generally, a professional referencing agency, if there's an unresolved county court judgment, they will just fail the tenant, which will mean that you will not get rent guarantee insurance. So you will always get a fail from a referencing agency on that. And then there's the affordability check. The way most referencing agencies, and this is what we advise as well, is that you have 30 times the income of the monthly rent. So if your rent is £1,000 per month, you should be looking for a household income of at least £30,000 per annum. If you've got a guarantor, you should be looking for 36 times the monthly rent. So a income for the guarantor on a rent of £1,000 a month should be £36,000. You should be looking for a guarantor if the tenant doesn't quite meet that affordability criteria. And if you are looking for a guarantor because the affordability check, the tenant doesn't satisfy the affordability check, you should be still thinking, well, okay, even though we've got a guarantor, how is this tenant going to afford to live in this property? Because ideally, the guarantor is there if you need to claim the rent off them, but it's not a situation you want to be in. It's a fail-safe.
It's a last-ditch resort.
It's a last-ditch resort, exactly. It's not something you really want to be doing. So just in short, ask those questions and don't be afraid to ask lots of questions. I think landlords generally don't ask enough questions to their tenants. You do these checks, you do the employment, the landlord, the affordability, the credit, look at the bank statements, and then ask a few questions.
It's there for the benefit of the tenant as well as you.
Gather your information and then ask a few questions if you've got some to ensure that tenancy is going to be run correctly. And then generally we see that landlords that do this are the landlords that don't generally have any problems when they go into the tenancy. And sometimes, unfortunately, you will have to say no, but it's better to say no and maybe have a small void period than to end up with a tenant that you're evicting and end up with lots and lots of months of no rent. So let's look at the checklist for referencing. Decide whether you're going to use a professional referencing agency or do it yourself. You need that employment check. You need to get You need to do a bit of digging yourself to get third-party details for the employer. You need, if they're self-employed, you need to get the accountant's details and you need to look for tax returns. You need to get their bank statements. You need to get their previous landlord details and then do a bit of digging to find out that landlord is genuine, and you need to prepare your list of questions for that landlord. You need to do a credit check and you need to review that credit check, and you need to ensure that the affordability check, so that's 30 times the monthly rent, and then if you're going for a guarantor, you need to know that the affordability is 36 times the monthly rent, and ensure that the guarantor undergoes the same kind of referencing that you're imposing upon on the tenant. Okay, so moving on to right to rent, which is a very important part of the process, and if it isn't done correctly, could end up with you being unable to successfully serve a Section 21 notice. So Polly is going to take us through what you're required to do by legislation, and then we'll take you through what we think you should do to fully protect yourself.
So not only could you not be able to serve a Section 21 notice, it could actually end up in a custodial sentence and a hefty fine if you persistently fail to carry out right to rent checks. So it's quite a severe one to know how to do properly. So right to rent checks, I'm sure everyone's aware of them. They were quite heavily publicised when they came out a couple of years ago. So basically it's a check of everybody's right to rent in the UK. So anybody who lets your property over the age of 18, whether or not they're named on the tenancy agreement, if you've got a tenancy agreement, in fact, must be checked. Their ability to be in the UK, and so you're basically becoming a border control agent as a landlord, they have to have a right to rent check. So the only exceptions to this is if they are moving into a care home, a hostel, or social housing. Everyone else, I'm afraid, it is your responsibility to carry this out. That said, even in those situations, we would recommend that you do carry out a right to rent check, purely to cover yourself. You've then got the checks, you've got the information, and you're good to go. So the check itself is actually quite simple. It sounds scary, but it's not really. Firstly, you need to ascertain who will be living in your property, who will be your tenants, which adults over 18 will be living in the house. Once you've done that, you need to meet with the tenants face to face and ascertain who they are, and if they are who they say they are, and get some original documents. That can be a passport, an ID card. There's a list of quite a significant list of documents that you can use, and that's available on the government website and the Landlord University as well, that prove that they have a right to live in the UK. Now, the only time that you don't have to meet with that tenant is if they're not actually in the UK at the time of the check. You can then carry out the check via video conferencing, so Skype or FaceTime or something like that. However, you do then have to meet with them face to face before the tenancy starts, so you will only then be carrying out a custodial tenancy agreement. If the right to rent check doesn't check out when you actually meet with them face to face, you can't proceed with the tenancy agreement. So what you have to do is you have to meet with them. There's no way around this, unfortunately. Check that their documents match who they say they are. So have a look at the documents, check they're genuine, take a photograph of the documents or a photocopy, and make a record that you've made that check. You also have to keep that document and keep the paperwork as well. If you fail to do this, as I say, there is an unlimited fine now, and you can be sent to prison if you rent your property to somebody without doing this. So it is a really important check to do.
So the majority of the time, you're just going to be asking to see the passport and taking a copy
Absolutely.
of that. And then you need to store that information, you need to store that just in case you need to prove that you've done the check for how long?
You have to store the documentation for the entire duration of the tenancy, and then for 12 months afterwards as well.
And this brings us on to the next issue, which is if you are storing personal data of that depth. The passport is quite an in-depth document of someone's personal data. You are required to be registered with the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO. Now this is like the data protection ombudsman. So if you're holding personal data on your customers or clients, and your tenant is essentially your customer, then you need to be registered with them, and you need to adhere to their procedures of the data storage. And if there's ever any issues, the tenant has somewhere to go, they have somewhere to complain to, and then the ICO will adjudicate whether that complaint has weight, and then decide what the consequences of that complaint are. The risk is fairly low, especially when you've only got one or two tenants. But as a company, we have seen the downfalls of that risk. We had a tenant, and the tenant had a data protection breach, and they had some identity fraud. Now, they knew that we held their passport, and they decided that it was us as a company who had undergone the breach, or one of our staff was committing the fraud, and they decided to take us to court under the Data Protection Act. And they hired a very prominent QC in London, a corporate litigator, to pursue us for quite substantial punitive damages. Now, we had obviously are registered with the ICO, and we had them adjudicate the case, and we were completely exonerated from any wrongdoing, and it was nothing to do with us. But even after the ICO had made their adjudication, they still went after us, and we with our legal team and are able to defend, and it didn't really end up going anywhere. As a company, you expect the odd legal challenge, especially when you do a high volume of business, and it's expected within the course of business, and we're able to deal with it. As a landlord, and as a landlord myself, if I was facing that kind of challenge, it would have been a far more stressful situation. So our advice is register with the ICO. It's about £30 a year, and they're very, very helpful. Or just get someone else to do the right to rent check for you. And there's lots and lots of solutions, Urban being one of them, that don't break the bank of someone just taking that responsibility away from you.
As Adam said, it can be a stressful time, and it is worth noting that with the ICO, anybody who touches anyone's data, so if you're a landlord on your own, that's fine. It would just be yourself that would need to register. But if you work with a business partner or you're a small company, anybody who touches tenants' data does need to be registered independently. And it's also worth noting that whilst it's £30 for a year, you do have to take into account follow-up checks for right to rent documents. So if you've got a tenant that's in place who has a visa that could potentially run out in 6 months, you will have to go back and do follow-up checks on that. So you will be running into multiple years of requiring the ICO registration. So just make sure that everybody's registration is up to date as an ongoing concern. It is vitally important.
Okay, so checklist on right to rent. So you'll need to meet the tenants, you'll need to physically see the documents, you'll need to figure out which documents you need, and as I said, in most cases this is going to be a copy of the passport. You need to take a copy of the documents, then you need to store the documents for the duration of the tenancy and 1 year afterwards.
Yeah.
And register with the ICO if you're going to do all of this yourself. Okay, so moving on to the deposits. Now, there's a number of schemes out there. We recommend My Deposits, and most schemes will now offer you either a custodial scheme whereby you hand the money over to the scheme, or a insurance base whereby you hold the money and you pay a fee to the scheme to protect the deposit. There's two main parts for a deposit. You need to protect it with the scheme, and you have 30 days from the day you take the money, not from the start of the tenancy agreement. From the day you take the money, you have 30 days to protect this money with a scheme. So that's the first part. And just registering with a scheme isn't enough. You have to register with a scheme and then protect your specific deposit with that scheme. And then once it's protected, you have to serve the prescribed information to the tenant. And this will differ slightly. Exactly what documents you need to give to the tenant will differ slightly depending on what scheme. But each scheme has a very clear process that you need to follow, and it is best just to ask them or look up their process. They're very aware of that process, so a quick phone call or look on their website and it will detail exactly what you need to do. It's a good idea, and most schemes require this, to get a signature from the tenant on the prescribed information or the certificate. Depends on which scheme you're using, as to which document you'll need that signature on. And you'll need to sign it yourself, and you'll need to provide certain details about yourself and the property on the prescribed information or certificate. As I said, it does depend on which scheme you use. It's a good idea to get that signature, whether you need it or not, according to the scheme, so you can prove you've done that. So you need to register the deposit, and you need to get that prescribed information sent out. You need proof that you've sent it, and you need a signature.
There's a few changes coming up in the world of deposits as well that I'm sure everyone is aware of. Queen made reference to them in her speech at the opening of Parliament this year. So the changes that are coming up are the changes to a holding deposit, when you can take at the start of tenancy proceedings. That will be changed to, we don't know when any of these are coming in. These were just sort of noted as incoming changes. So that will be taken down to, you'll only be able to take a week's deposit as a holding deposit. And then the deposit for a property, you will only be able to take 4 weeks worth of rent for that. So anybody who takes a slightly higher deposit, if they potentially accept pets or have a property that has sort of higher maintenance fees or anything like that, unfortunately at some stage in the we presume not too distant future, that will be changing. So that's just something to consider with your deposits.
Okay, so the next section is contract. Obviously, we're not legally trained, so we're talking about a high-level overview of what you should be looking for and what you should and shouldn't be doing with contracts, and what we hear a lot from landlords and get questioned on. One of the things that we see a lot is, especially with properties that have been let for years and years, a lot of landlords like to use the same contract over and over again because it has specifics about the property. Now that's a good idea, and it's we don't discourage putting specifics about the property in. It's a very good idea. What we recommend is extracting everything specific about the property into a document so it can easily be updated to a new contract. You should be looking for an up-to-date contract at least every year or 2 years, or perhaps even every time you relet the property. We see new legislation come out pretty much constantly. That's why we have the Landlord University, to track this new legislation, and more often than not that legislation affects what you need to have in your AST. So it's a good idea to keep your AST up to date, and organisations such as the National Landlord Association, they always have a current contract that can be downloaded and used, and you can put additional clauses specific to your property in at the end of the contract. So it's a good idea to keep your contract up to date, so that you know you've got a good contract in place.
It's also worth mentioning, do make sure you're using the correct contract for the type of let that you're doing. Whilst an AST is a very useful contract for the majority of lets, general lets, obviously if you find yourself letting to a business, you'll need a very different type of contract to a standard AST. So if you think there might be a change, or if you find yourself in a different situation, do contact an expert for advice on this, because you don't want to find yourself, that people forget that the contract is a very important legal document. It's not just a piece of paperwork to be dealt with. That is the legally binding document that is holding this whole show together. So do make sure you're using the correct contract for your let.
So yeah, and the National Landlord Association, if you're a member, you'll be able to download a company contract, as Polly touched on there, a live-in landlord contract, room rents, and obviously the standard AST. So all those documents are there ready for you to download, so you've got the exact document you need. Another thing with contracts is extra clauses. Now, I talked about them earlier, and it is important to have clauses specific to your property, but clauses need to be reasonable. Otherwise, if you ever needed to go to court on a dispute on a specific clause, if they're not reasonable, then they just wouldn't hold up in court. An example of quite a simple example that we've had recently is the cleaning clause, saying that you have to professionally clean the property when you leave the property. Well, that's not actually something that could be upheld. If a tenant is able to do something themselves, you're not able to enforce that they have a professional service, and cleaning is an example of that. So if you do have a clause and you don't know whether it would hold up, again, it's best to ask your agent or the Landlord University or the National Landlord Association advice line, and they will be able to tell you whether it's a reasonable clause that would actually hold up. Right, with regards to getting your contract signed, sometimes it's a bit difficult to get everyone in the same place. Well, digital signatures are a viable solution now, and fairly easy to set up. We use them. It provides a log of the signatures. So you'll get an IP tracking, you'll get email address tracking. You'll be able to see exactly when the tenant reviewed the document, accepted the document, and signed the document. And they'll be able to do it on their phone. They'll be able to review the document on the train, on an iPad, on any device, and it is legally binding now. So it is definitely worth going for digital signatures, and it covers one of your prescription requirements, which I'll talk about in prescriptions in a minute. Okay, so moving on to prescriptions. So you are now required to give the tenant a copy of the gas safety, a copy of the EPC, the Energy Performance Certificate, a copy of the How to Rent booklet, which we can provide, the NLA can provide, or you can download off the government website, gov.uk, and a fully signed copy of your tenancy agreement. You need to be able to provide those to the tenant and prove that you have provided those to the tenant. It's no good saying, well, look, I have a gas safety. You have to have given that and shown that to your tenant. If you can't prove that you've done that and you wanted to issue a Section 21, it could be a reason for the court to not let you issue a Section 21 notice. So all those documents need to be provided to the tenant, ideally on the start date or before the start date of the tenancy. As I said, with digital contracts, generally when a digital contract is fully signed by all parties, the software that you use automatically sends that fully signed document to all the parties. So using a digital signature usually does that part for you. Here at Urban, we like to go one step further. We provide all these documents via email, and then we set up another digital signature document saying the tenant that they have received all those documents. So we know that we can prove that all those documents have been sent to the tenant, and the tenant has actually acknowledged them. So we go that step further. Okay, so if you have a guarantor, you'll need a guarantor agreement, which again is something that you can get from the National Landlord Association. And the guarantor will need to sign this document, and they'll need to sign it to say that they will be paying the rent if the tenant fails to do so. That means that they should be able to afford that, and generally guarantor should be able to afford 36 times the monthly rent. So if their monthly rent is £1,000, then their income should be at least £36,000 per year. You should check the guarantor in the same way you check a tenant, using a referencing agency, or if you're doing it yourself, do that all-important employment check, credit check, and ensure that they can afford to meet that obligation. Okay, so your contract checklist. So make sure that you have an up-to-date contract. Make sure that you've got the right contract for your let. Make sure that if you have any extra clauses, that you've checked them and that they would stand up and that they're reasonable. Make sure that the contract is fully signed. Make sure that if you are using digital signatures, that you are not using them on deeds that need to be witnessed. Ensure that you have sent all your prescribed information, so that is the gas safety, the EPC, the How to Rent booklet, and the fully signed contract. If you need a guarantor, ensure that you have a fully signed guarantor contract and that they are fully referenced. But the next part in the process is the inventory process, one that a lot of landlords seem to miss out. We did a webinar recently on deposits. We did two on deposits with Susie Hirschman from My Deposits, who is head of adjudication. And we asked her why it seems that so many situations always got resolved in the tenant's favour. And the answer that she gave us was simple. She said it's just because the lack of evidence that the landlord presents. That is the key time to build your evidence and to build good evidence is at the start of the tenancy through a really good inventory. It's a good idea to get a professional inventory done by a third party, because that adds extra weight, because that third party will be unbiased. But that's not to say you can't do it yourself. The National Landlord Association provides a fantastic download of a pro forma inventory for you to just fill in. You should get lots and lots of photos, and those photos need to be time and date stamped, which most devices such as iPad and iPhones do now. But it's very important to get that condition report and inventory supported with those photos. One example is a bathroom. We had an example where the bathroom was mistreated, so there was lots of mould in all the seals, and the landlord wanted to charge for that mould to be dug out and resealed. But there was no proof that the mould wasn't there at the start of the tenancy. So the landlord said, well, I've got a receipt for professional cleaning at the start of the tenancy, which he thought would be good enough for that proof. But that didn't prove that the mould wasn't there. If you'd had that receipt plus a photo of the seals that were showing that the mould wasn't there, then that would have been good enough. So that claim wasn't successful. So in-depth photos, it's a good idea to have receipts and invoices for work carried out. And if you have receipts and invoices for professional cleaning, make them as detailed as possible. Bathroom professionally cleaned or flat C professionally cleaned isn't going to do too much for you. If you have a list of works that have been carried out, that's going to help you, but the ultimate is those photos. Also, getting the inventory signed off by the tenant is very important, and that will add extra weight to that inventory, giving them that opportunity to review the inventory, sign it off, add any comments. If you've got a really detailed document at the start of the tenancy, it's your evidence, and you've got a big docket of evidence that will support any claim that could be at the end of the inventory. And also, Polly, it's a good idea to include your prescribed information with that document. Just put it all together in one document.
I think that the fewer documents you can bombard your tenants with at the start of a let is probably the best. I think if you're serving documents like that via email, one email from you with everything that they need for the property is probably useful. Certainly if they need to go back and refer to anything, they've got one document rather than 100 scattered around their inbox. Yeah. It's probably easier for them. Certainly if you're asking them to sign documents, it's just a nice way of doing it, I think.
Yeah.
It's you want to start off on a good foot with them, and I think bombarding them with hundreds of documents is not going to be the best way to start your relationship with them.
Yeah, I tend to create a check-in pack which encompasses all my prescriptions, deposits, inventory, and the safety risk assessment that we'll talk about next. Okay, so our checklist for inventories is get a pro forma document from somewhere like the National Landlord Association. Ensure you have as many photos as possible. Ensure those photos are time and date stamped. Ensure you include any invoices for work, any cleaning, anything you've got receipts at the start that's been done before the start of the tenancy, and make sure that it's signed off by the tenant. Okay, so we recently did almost an hour-long webinar on safety, which was very in-depth, and it's definitely worth a listen to. But a lot of the feedback we got was that landlords wanted a sort of a go-to checklist of what they should be doing before they start a tenancy. So that's what we're going to try and create for you now. So let's start with gas. Gas is the easy one. You need a gas safety every 12 months, and it needs to be done by a gas safe engineer.
They're very easy to find. The Gas Safe Register website notes all of the Gas Safe registered engineers in your area. All you have to do is pop in your postcode, and it will bring up all the people that are registered to do the check in your area. All you have to do is obviously make an appointment with one of them. They'll come round and check your gas in your property, your appliances in your property, and issue you with a certificate, which you then have to pass on to your tenant. Do make sure that they have a copy of that. That is part of the legislation. And also when you start a new tenancy, you do have to provide that as part of the prescribed information to your tenant. So that is a vital part of the legislation.
And you have to provide a clear and dated copy. And that sounds obvious, but we've had instances where gas safety certificates haven't been dated, or they're barely readable. So a clear and dated copy. Okay, smoke alarms. Now, this provoked quite a lot of questions from the safety webinar. You need a smoke alarm on every floor of your property.
Absolutely. Smoke alarms differ quite significantly with regards to whether you're running an HMO or a standard residential property. With regards to standard residential properties, you just need a smoke alarm on every floor of the property. Doesn't currently need to be hardwired. Obviously, there's a Grenfell investigation going on at the moment, and we are potentially expecting changes within this legislation. But currently, you need a battery operated smoke alarm on every floor of your residential property. These are available, they're not expensive to buy. We'd recommend the 10-year battery operated alarms. It means your tenant can't take the battery out if it starts to if they need a battery for their remote control, but just a standard battery operated alarm. And your requirement is that you test this at the beginning of the tenancy. The requirement for testing then falls to the tenant. However, we would suggest that when you enter the property for your gas safety, or if you're doing regular maintenance checks, just press the button. For your own peace of mind, make a test of the alarm. All it takes is the push of a button. The alarms are designed to be tested with a button, and if all it takes is the push of a button for your own peace of mind, it's well worth doing. And
that brings me on to the test button, because we had a huge amount of questions from landlords about the test button. Now, the manufacturer provides a test button. Now, that test button means that if you press it and the alarm goes off, the alarm is working.
It certainly is.
It is not a test button to test if the beeper's working.
No.
It is a test button to test that the smoke alarm is a working smoke alarm.
Yeah.
The question that we received is, when I test the button, how do I know the alarm's working, not just the beeper? Well, you are required to press the test button, which the manufacturer has given to you as a test that the alarm is a working smoke alarm. And that is what you're required to do, and that is what the manufacturer has given that test button to do. It's not a test that the beeper's working, it's a test that the alarm works.
There's no need to cook some toast underneath the alarm to check that the smoke alarm is working.
Okay, so that's smoke alarms. Moving on to CO alarms. Again, a lot of confusion on CO alarms. A lot of people think that if you've got a gas boiler, you need one. You need a CO alarm if you have solid fuel burning appliances within your house. Now, that's generally going to be wood, coal and oil.
Yeah.
Gas is covered by your gas safety. So your CO alarm is for wood, coal and oil, generally for solid fuel.
And that alarm then needs to be in the room with that appliance. So if you've got an open fire, you will in the living room, you will need a CO alarm in that room. If you've got an oil boiler, you will need a CO alarm in the room with that appliance. If you have both of those things, you'll need two alarms, an alarm in each room. So you'll need two alarms, and they will need to be tested in the same way that the smoke alarm is tested. So you have a responsibility to do it at the start of the tenancy. That then falls to the responsibility of the tenant. However, best practice, we would recommend at every opportunity that you enter the property, just press the button and document when you've done it, how you've done it, and that it's working.
Okay, so fire safety. This is a common sense approach one. There's not any definite legislation that you have to follow. You can look at the LaCour's guide and download that guide, which is a very good guide and shows you specifics on different types of properties and things that you should be thinking about. You are required to have a fire blanket in the kitchen, which is a fairly easy thing. They cost about £10 to put in the kitchen. It's a good idea to prove that you've done that and to get an acknowledgement from the tenant they've received the blanket and that they've received instructions on how to use it. Again, this is an area we've got a lot of questions from landlords saying, well, I've received advice that it's better to use a damp tea towel than than a fire blanket. Well, that may be the case, but you can't provide a damp tea towel to the tenants. Legislation says you need to provide a fire blanket, so that's what you need to do.
With regards to HMOs, obviously the legislation is different. However, the Le Cause Guide does provide very, very clear information for different types of properties, and the guidance is different with regards to different parts of the country. So we would recommend having a look at the Le Cause Guide, identifying the type of property that you own, and using that as your guide for what you need to do. And as I said earlier, we would anticipate changes following the Grenfell inquiry. So we will obviously keep you updated on the Landlord University with regards to any changes in the legislation.
Now, moving on to electricity, which again is another one that generated a lot of questions for us. There is currently no requirement to have a electrical safety certificate.
Unless you're in Scotland.
Within your property. There is a liability. You have to take a common sense approach. If you have wires hanging out on a light fitting and the tenant electrocutes himself, you could be liable. So it is a common sense approach. You are required for the tenant to have quiet and safe enjoyment within their property.
Under the Landlord and Tenant Act, you have responsibility for the electrics, water and gas in the property to be under good order. So there is a legal responsibility to make sure that the electrics in the property are safe, but there is no defined legislation on how to maintain and upkeep the electrics within your property, unless you're in Scotland, in which case you do have to follow the same guidelines of an HMO, where you have to have an electrical safety test once every 5 years.
So if you want to go over and above with electricity, you get that every 5 years check and get that yearly PAT test on all your appliances that you're providing as well. But there's no actual requirement to do that at the moment. Legionella, another one which always provokes
one of the most confusing areas.
Again, you're not required, and the health and safety executive does not recognise a certificate passing for Legionella, but again, you could be held liable if your tenant suffers from Legionella. So it's a good idea at the start of the tenancy to do some basic tests to ensure that the risk is not there or is low. What I do, all my properties have combi boilers, so what I do is I just check the temperature of the water in the various places, bathrooms and kitchen sinks. By running the water, you're reducing the risk as well, because any standing water in pipes is being run through. But if the temperature is below 20 degrees, or your cold water is below 20 degrees, or above 45 degrees, which is unlikely your cold water is going to be above 45 degrees, then it's outside the range at which the bacteria will live. So you can safely say that if you've tested the temperature of the water and it's inside those ranges, then you've got no risk. And if you document taking that temperature, then you're fine. If it is within the range of 20 to 45 degrees, then potentially you are at risk. The water is at risk. So then you can take samples of the water and send them off and get them tested for the bacteria. If you do that simple testing at the start of a tenancy agreement, then you should be fine. If it's a combi boiler, then it's really just the cold water you're checking, because the boiler will heat the cold water. If you have other areas of standing water like tanks, then you'll need to test the temperature of those places. If the temperature is between 20 and 45 degrees of any standing water, you may want to consider then taking a sample of that water and sending it off to get checked. In most cases, it won't be within that range, so just doing that test. What I do is I do that test and I photograph the thermometer that I'm taking the temperature with, and then put that on record and get the tenants to sign off that at the start of the tenancy. And that shows that I've made a risk assessment for Legionella at the start of the tenancy.
As Adam's just mentioned, it's a big part of the safety check. So is the record taking, and actually making note of the tests that you do, the results that you get when you've taken the tests is a hugely important requirement. And just very simple notes of tested smoke alarm, it worked, and tested it on this date. That proves that is creating an audit trail and creating documentation for you. Just make notes of that and file it away. Should the worst happen, touch wood it won't, but should the worst happen, you then have documented proof that you did all that you could to keep that property and your tenants safe.
Okay, so let's go over our safety checklist. So this is a checklist that I create when I start a tenancy, and just tick all the boxes, and then I get the tenant to sign off on it as well. So first one is the easy one, gas safety. Have I got a gas safety? Is it in date? Is it a clear copy? Is it a dated copy? Then smoke alarms. Is there a smoke alarm on every floor, and does that smoke alarm work? Has it been tested? CO alarm. Do I need one? I need one if I've got a solid fuel burning appliance. It's not a bad idea to have one, so if I have one, has it been tested? Fire safety, have I got the fire blanket in the kitchen, and has the tenant acknowledged they've got the instructions and know how to use it? Electricity, am I happy that the electric is safe in the property? Have I taken that common sense approach, and am I happy that it's safe? If I want to go a step further, have I got my 5-year check, and have I done a yearly pat test on all the appliances? And Legionella, have I done that risk assessment? Have I taken the temperature of the water, and then if it's within the risk range of the temperature, have I sent a sample off at the beginning of the tenancy? If you cover off all those points, create a document, send that document to the tenant, get them to sign it off, you have covered the legislation points that a landlord needs to do so at the beginning of a tenancy. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. If you have any feedback about this webinar, any questions that we haven't covered, please do email info@urban.co.uk, and we'll get them answered and post them on the Landlord University. There'll be a recording of this on the Landlord University, and a download of all the checklists as well. If you have any requests for future webinars, please do email us and tell us as well. So thank you very much for being with us tonight. Thank you, Polly.
Thank you for having me.
And watch out for the next one. What's the next one going to be on?
I do believe it is on licensing, one of the nicely contentious topics that everybody loves.
Oh, fantastic. I'm sure it's going to be popular. We've got a great speaker lined up for that as well. So please do join us for that one. Okay, thank you very much. Good night.